All right, so I guess we can go ahead and get started, and then just launch right in if you're all ready to go.
Okay.
All
Well,
right.
let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, amen. Holy beloved Father, your Son Jesus taught us that there is great rejoicing in heaven whenever someone lost is found, whenever someone exalted, rejected, or discarded is gathered into our we, which thus becomes ever wider. We ask you to grant the followers of Jesus and all people of goodwill the grace to do your will on earth. Bless each act of welcome and outreach that draws those in exile into the we of community and of the church, so that our earth may truly become what you yourself created it to be, the common home of all our brothers and sisters. Amen. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Melissa, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Deacon Fred. So thank you to everybody who is in attendance today, and welcome to today's webinar for National Migration Week. This week is designed to reflect on the situation of migrants, refugees, and displaced peoples in the world. And the 2021 theme, Towards an Ever Wider We, comes from Pope Francis's latest encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, calling us to think no longer in terms of them and those, but only us. So today's webinar is going to focus a little bit on this situation, specifically in the United States. And our panelists will describe some of the current migration-related issues in our country, and also the church teaching behind the response that's coming from various church-related agencies and individuals. And so I'll go ahead and introduce all of our panelists. They're all very well versed in these migration-related issues. First up, Todd Scribner is the Assistant Director of Education and Outreach at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, or USCCB, in the Department of Migration and Refugee Services. Here he works on the intersection between migration policy, US history, and Catholic ethics. And he works with various institutions and provides resources, including those related to National Migration Week and the Vatican's World Day for Migrants and Refugees. David Spicer also works at the USCCB in the Department of Migration and Refugee Services. As a policy advisor, he provides the USCCB, bishops, dioceses, and others with policy recommendations and analysis of migration-related issues, including regarding the root causes of migration. This also includes working with direct service providers to address their needs and concerns. And finally, Dylan Corbett is the founding director of Hope Border Institute, a Catholic research, advocacy, and humanitarian aid NGO located on the US-Mexico border. Dylan is also the Assistant Regional Coordinator for North America, Central America, and the Caribbean with the Vatican section on migrants and refugees. He previously worked for the USCCB as well. So I'd like to thank each of these experts for joining us today to share a little bit about their insight and knowledge with us. And hopefully we'll have a very interesting conversation about it. We will try to save a little bit of time at the end for a Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to what we can. So thank you again. So Todd, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you, Deacon Fred. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with y'all and sort of your audience. And I want to talk a little bit about Catholic social teaching, some challenges that I think that we face in our contemporary context, some of the things that we need to avoid, but also lay out some of the ways and the principles that the church uses in order to approach the issue of migration. And hopefully, you could go on for hours about this sort of thing, but hopefully, I'll touch on some of the key points, and then we'll have an opportunity, as Melissa mentioned, have a conversation. You can provide me with any information and ideas that would be helpful, because I'm always looking for some good insights on this sort of thing. It's a complex and robust issue. I think that the first thing that really needs to be said is that when we're talking about sort of an ethic that sort of responds to the migration question, and really a whole slew of other questions that are not even migration related, but other policy areas and other kind of areas of culture, the economy, so on and so forth, is that, it's rooted in scripture and in Catholic social teaching. It's not, we have the Bible to which we can turn and use to better understand, the kind of the moral framework that's used by the church and by Catholics and by Christians more generally. And then we have the Catholic social teaching tradition, which sort of has emerged over the past 2,000 years as the church has wrestled with a whole range of issues and encountered problems and new topics of concern. In our age, I think one of the dangers is that the Catholic social teaching ethic can become unrooted from the scriptural component, and both are needed. This is particularly true in a world that some might say is post-Christian to a certain extent, or at least where Christianity does not have the vibrancy in terms of its cultural informing kind of framework as it once did, several hundred years ago, when we're fighting a growing secular elite, when we're fighting or up against, competing worldviews that may take away from a Christian vision. And so that's sort of one component. And when you have an issue like migration, which is so contentious and so polarizing, and that really at the same time demands a political perspective and sort of policy, policy solutions to help deal with the problems that we're facing, we can get so focused on the here and now and on kind of the ethical principles, and we lose sight of kind of their sources in terms of their meaning. And I want to give 2 examples to try and spell out what I mean by this. And then once I do that, turn to some of the principles that we use sort of on a practical level to inform kind of our work as Catholics and sort of as the church. I mean, the first one is the issue of human rights, which is a perfectly legitimate kind of framework for understanding our engagement in the field of migration. I mean, over the past century, the human rights paradigm has become increasingly prevalent within the church as sort of a framing mechanism. The danger with the human rights paradigm, though, is that when it becomes, when there's no limiting sort of factor that kind of helps to define the arena within which human rights kind of functions and performs, one of the dangers is that sort of this everything kind of becomes a right, and that we can sort of lay claim to sort of whatever desires and wants can become rights. It becomes distracted, sort of unrooted from notions of duty. It can become unrooted from moral obligations that we might have that may limit sort of our claims to a human right. And I think that one of the things that we as Catholics need to constantly be aware is that we often view human rights as an outgrowth of human dignity, which can be understood, but we tend to kind of make them interchangeable. But our notion of human dignity is, as my understanding, is really rooted in sort of Old Testament scripture, namely the Imago Dei. We are made in the image of God. This being made in the image of God gives us kind of a worth and a value that is lost when we lose sight of that sort of Imago Dei component. And the notion of human rights kind of brings breadth and depth and substance to that notion of the Imago Dei in terms of sort of our understanding of our ethics. I mean, the notion of human dignity and the Imago Dei precedes the idea of human rights for centuries. And so human rights is not necessarily or the notion of human dignity is not necessarily driven by a sort of a commitment to a human rights paradigm, but we are made in the image of God. This is absolutely crucial. Why is this important for the immigration issue? Because it relativizes the importance of national origins. It relativizes the importance of ethnic and racial allegiances. And it centers moral discussions on the person and not on the group to which they belong, sort of these artificial categories that are often created to divide rather than to include other people. And so, when these kinds of commitments to kind of group identities become pronounced over and above one's understanding of the human person and one's understanding of the human person as rooted in as an image, as being made in the image of God, we lose sight of really a key component of Catholic life. And we can see this reflected in the Pope's World Day of Migrants and Refugees message, namely, that we are working towards an ever wider we. And what I mean by that is that he warns against, for example, let me just read this really quickly. He says that both in the wider world and within the church, crumbling and cracking due to myopic and aggressive forms of nationalism and radical individualism. This sort of we, this sort of notion of us is, and the highest price is being paid by those who most easily become viewed as others, foreigners, migrants, the marginalized, those living on the existential peripheries. And so we have to sort of transcend these sort of arbitrary kind of social groupings that make sense to some extent, but which can actually create division and difference between those whom we are called to care and provide support to. Then there's also the notion of social justice, which again is key and a component of Catholic life. We are trying to make the world a better place for everyone. We want to make sure that opportunities are given to everyone to achieve their talents and their skills that are given by God. We want to make sure that policies are put into place that benefit everyone and don't exclude anyone. And that's a critical component. But again, when we're talking about the migration field, we need to realize that our work as a church is not merely aimed towards temporal ends. It's aimed towards eternity as well. We want the certain policies to be put into place, and David and Dylan will probably talk to them, I imagine. But that's not alone. As the church, we look towards eternity. And you can see this really in Scripture, I think, the way in which the stranger and the migrant are greeted. So in Genesis, for example, Abraham willingly became a migrant in response to God's command to go forth from the land, your relatives, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. He and Sarah extended bounteous hospitality to 3 strangers who are a manifestation of the Lord. It is in their hospitality that the Lord promises Abraham that Sarah would bear a son the following year. This is like eternal ramifications. This is not just about doing good for some temporal reward, but for an eternal one. And for that matter, looking toward the future, I should say. In Matthew 25, we're called to welcome the stranger, and there's a striking contrast here. On the one hand, Jesus says, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you and from the foundation of the world." These are for people who welcome the stranger, who feed the hungry, who clothe those who are naked. And then to those who do not do that, he says, "Depart from me, you accursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devils and the angels." We are called to welcome the stranger, yes, and put into place policies that matter and policies that help those who are on the margins and who are kind of outside the circle that might be us. But really, these are eternal implications to whether or not we respond. And that's, I think, an important component of two brief examples that I'd be happy to flesh out further, but an important component of why we do what we do. It's not just for the here and now, it's for the eternal. And while that's the case, there are some practical principles that we do use when we're kind of engaging in the migration question. And those practical principles are really an outgrowth of centuries-long Catholic social teaching. You can find them sort of listed specifically out in somewhere like Strangers No Longer, which is a pastoral letter written by the bishops of the United States and Mexico in 2003 and issued in 2003. And those 5 principles really are the following. Number 1, persons have the right to find opportunities in their homeland. People should not be forced to move. They should not feel the need to move. They should not migrate out of necessity, but merely out of choice. They should find the opportunities to feed their children, to give them education, to find jobs in their homeland. And where that is not happening, where that is not a possibility, there's a problem that needs to be addressed. At the same time, persons have the right to migrate to support themselves and their families. Where people are not able to feed their children, where people are not able to find jobs or to educate their families and so on, they should have the right to migrate to a place that they have the better capacity to do so. The third principle, and we're going to talk a little bit about this down below, because there at least is an apparent tension, or at least there seems to me, is the sovereign nations have the right to control their borders. This is the third principle. So the bishops are not open borders, and they do not support sort of just unlimited migration for any reason whatsoever. There is an authority that sovereign nations have to control their borders and to manage migration in a way. And we're going to I'll return to that in a second when I do some reflections, but it's not unlimited, obviously. Fourth principle, refugees and asylum seekers should be afforded protection. I mean, this really calls, refugees are, basically displaced from their home because of threats of violence or violence because of their religion, because of their politics, because of their political ideas, because of their belonging to a particular group. They're particularly vulnerable because the state itself wants to destroy the people that they are displacing for the most part. And so they should be provided particular protection because they are not being provided the protection that is due to them by the state of which they are a part. And finally, the human dignity and human rights, we'll get back to this theme as we sort of began at the beginning, of undocumented migrants should be respected. So we need to figure out ways for people who are here illegally, how do we properly respond to the reasons why they're here illegally, properly respond to what do we do with them when they're here illegally. The church has a long tradition of calling for a broad-based and generous legalization for people who are here and who have contributed to society, who have families, who work, who demonstrated a desire to become part of the local communities. And that's important. Now, 3 thoughts, because I know we only have a couple minutes left on mine. Is first of all, these 5 principles, I pointed you to strangers no longer, but they're really rooted in papal teaching. So for example, Rerum Novarum, Leo XIII, well over 100 years ago, noted in this encyclical that people are not going to move if they have the opportunities in their homeland. They're not going to migrate, generally speaking, because they feel they have to. They will stay where they are and they will thrive where they are. Nobody wants to be forced to move. Nobody wants to move to a foreign country where they don't speak the language, where they won't have any legal protections, where they can't find legal work, where they have to send money home to families that they will not see for months or years at a time, potentially. They want to be able to thrive in their homeland. So you can see it reflected in Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum. You can also see in Pacem Terris and in other encyclicals references to the right of people to migrate, but also the right of sovereign nations to control their borders. And this really brings into question, so how do we, if people have a right to migrate, if they can't support themselves and their families, but states have a right to control their borders, how do you respond to that situation? And it's something I wrestle with, to be honest. And I think that's something that, has been talked about quite a bit in the literature. One way in which I think you can kind of make sense of this is by sort of applying sort of the idea of the preferential option for the poor, right? I mean, that those who are poor, those who are marginalized, those who have nothing should have a kind of preferential option given to them. They should be given special treatment so that they can stand on their own, so that they can thrive, so that they can become established. It's critical in that regard, then, when we look at migrants who move out of necessity and not necessarily out of desire or want, or because they want to, when they come to the United States, that we need to be generous and we need to be open and we need to kind of provide a preferential option to migrants as well. And in the same vein as we provide a preferential option for the poor. And for rich countries, has been cited time and time again in encyclicals and Migration Day messages by popes, Benedict XVI and John Paul II and before them, is that rich countries have a particular duty and a responsibility to share their wealth with other countries and to share their surplus with people who want to come here. And so that is actually, a critical component of this as well. And, the United States is such a country. What does this mean in terms of sharing your wealth? We need to really kind of start to address the idea of root causes, which is a critical component as well. That's really the long-term solution. It's to try and figure out why people feel the need to move and to address the problems on the ground in the sending countries so that they can thrive where they are and not move to somewhere else where they are sometimes not wanted, unfortunately. And let me just close, in 2000, I think it was the 2015 World Day of Migrants and Refugees message. Pope Francis, talks about a church without borders. And I think moving forward, I think this has been done a little bit, but I think this is an open question, and maybe I've missed some stuff, but how can we be a church without borders in a world with them? I mean, what does that mean? And how can we, I think this is a frontier, I think that we need to address more substantively. It's been done, I know that people have talked about it, but it's an area that is ripe for more research, for more thinking, for more prayer, to understand what does it mean to be a church without borders in a world that has them, that has borders, and that prevents people from crossing. And places where borders have actually become more solidified, and more dangerous and more difficult to cross. It seems as though on a state level, we're moving in an opposite direction from where we're supposed to be, from the perspective of the church. So those are some comments that I want to make. Obviously, there's a ton more that can be covered. And hopefully we can tackle some of these issues as we move forward into the question and answers. Maybe Dylan and David will have some insights that will be particularly apropos for some of the things I talked about.
I think we're on to me next, right, Melissa?
Yes. Thank you, Todd, for that very insightful look into this rich area, as you said. Now we'll have David up next.
Wonderful. Thanks, Melissa, and thank you to you as well, Deacon Fred, and welcome to everyone who's joining us. I am going to share my screen here. I have a few slides just to keep me on track and give everyone something to look at that isn't my face the whole time. So I will get those up on the screen here for you all to see. Hopefully you should all be able to see that. Are we very good, Melissa, on your end? Okay, perfect. So I just wanted to start off with sort of providing the context for this part of the webinar. And when I was asked to talk about policy, as you all can imagine, immigration policy is a very broad and complex area of policy and of law in our country and, of course, internationally. So in talking about it, I mean, there's just so many different aspects, but I figured I would sort of focus in on our current situation and the current push for immigration reform that we are living through at this very moment in Congress and in our country. So I have some statistics here that I think are illuminating toward that end and sort of helpful within the context of this particular discussion. So you see here that we have 10.5 million undocumented immigrants living in the United States, and each of those immigrants could be deported because of their lack of legal status. So these are people who are subject to immigration enforcement. Approximately 2/3 of them have lived in the United States for over a decade. So the majority of these 10.5 million people are long-time residents of the United States. Many of them have, of course, set down roots. They've had children. They are employees or themselves own businesses in this country. And so there's a lot of complications there, as you can imagine, that are involved with this population. And it's not as simple as, well, they're here without authorization, they're undocumented. So, sort of the solution would be to just deport all of them back to their countries of origin. There's a lot that really hinges on this single sort of idea of legal status. Going on further, we have the immigration courts, and there's this notorious backlog that's now reached over 1.4 million cases. So the immigration courts are sort of separate from the regular courts that you would think of in terms of, if you got a parking ticket, of course, that's something, but also the criminal courts. So immigration courts are distinct entities for adjudicating the cases of those applying for asylum, for example, in some cases, and other matters in which they are appealing a decision for them to be deported, things like that. So this is what the immigration courts exist for, solely for the purpose of adjudicating these sorts of cases. And all those applying for asylum aren't necessarily going through the immigration courts. We have those who are applying, who are here lawfully in the United States, whether on a visa or some other sort of mechanism that allows them to be here in the country. And so they're applying, they've submitted an application with what's called the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to remain here as an asylee. Once you're granted an asylum application, once that's approved, you become an asylee. And so those people aren't actually included in this 1.4 million cases that we have before the immigration courts. So that's sort of an added layer of people that aren't necessarily reflected in that number. The last major legislative immigration reform was in 1986, and that was with the passage of what was called the Immigration Reform and Control Act. So this is sort of a far-reaching piece of legislation that touched upon a number of different immigration-related issues in federal law. So immigration and immigration policy, for the most part, is very much a federal law issue, and immigration law is determined by members of Congress, by our congressional legislators. That was, of course, over 30 years ago that we had the last major legislative immigration reform, and a lot has changed since 1986. I mean, we, of course, have had major incidents such as September 11th, the terrorist attacks in 2001, and we just celebrated the 20th anniversary of those, and we all know those have had a significant impact on our culture and any number of aspects of our life in American society, and the world as a whole has changed very much since 1986. So in many countries in Central and South America, even Europe, and the Middle East, Africa, there's just been such significant changes in that period of time from now to 1986 that have resulted in a lot of different factors, these root causes of migration that Todd mentioned earlier, that force people to migrate or to have a need to migrate. So the length of time that it's been since the last major immigration reform is important to keep in mind for that reason. I'm going to go on to the next slide here, and I just wanted to touch upon sort of the church's role in immigration reform. The church is very much, and I specifically mean the bishops of the United States, and as represented through the USCCB in particular, are very much supporters of comprehensive immigration reform, sort of acknowledging this idea that it has been over 30 years since the last significant reform of our immigration laws. And comprehensive is used to describe immigration reform that does address a variety of issues related to the immigration system. So some, as many of you know, would prefer to focus on enforcement, for example, at the border. Others are maybe more concerned with visas and how we can improve the process for getting a visa to come to the United States. Well, the bishops and the church sort of broadly is very much in favor of ensuring that all of these different areas of the immigration system are improved so that we can better respond to those who are seeking to come to this country, especially those who are vulnerable and seeking protection. And so when we talk about comprehensive immigration reform, we sort of have these different areas that we believe should be included in that, or these different aspects that should be included. And so you see them here listed out: ensuring access to permanent legal status and a pathway to citizenship for current residents. That's the population of over 10 million that I referred to on the last slide, many of whom, like I said, have been here for more than a decade. Reaffirming and prioritizing family unity and reunification. Of course, this is sort of central to the church's teachings. And the family is considered the building block of our society. So we want families to be able to remain together, or if they've been separated because certain members of the family have migrated and others remain in the country of origin, that they can reunify and be together here in this country if that's where they ultimately settle. Reforming the immigration detention system. So, there has been, especially since the early 2000s, a growing emphasis on immigration detention, and rather than allowing people to reside within our society and to contribute as they're waiting for their cases to be adjudicated, there's greater emphasis on keeping them in detention centers, which we know are not conducive for human flourishing, and certainly don't allow people to live in accordance with their dignity in a lot of cases, their God-given dignity. We go on to evaluate and revise immigration enforcement strategies. Specifically, of course, you might think of the situation at the US-Mexico border, or even within the interior. Of course, we have cases of immigration enforcement happening within local communities quite a ways from the southern border, or the northern border for that matter. Moving on to promote access to protection, due process, and lawful pathways. This is for those specifically who are refugees seeking protection, asylum seekers. The difference between a refugee and asylum seeker is something that many people don't quite know. And of course, a refugee is somebody seeking protection from outside of the country. So those who are coming, for example, from Afghanistan. So they are seeking protection here in the United States, and they come as refugees. In many cases, there's a little bit of complexity there as well. Asylum seekers, however, are those who are already in the United States and they're seeking protection. So the requirements are essentially the same for refugees and asylum seekers. It's just a matter of where they are in the process and how they come to be in the country. And so ensuring due process for those folks and ensuring that people have the ability to come here through lawful pathways is critical. And then finally, something that Todd alluded to earlier, addressing root causes. We can do everything possible to improve and to ensure that the US immigration system is top notch. But ultimately, we do want people to have the ability to remain in their home countries and not be forced to migrate, to have the opportunities there that many come to the United States seeking. So that's sort of the church's view on reform, comprehensive reform in particular. The current efforts that I mentioned that we're living through as I speak, and this is an especially timely conversation for that. So I'm sure many of you have heard of what's called a reconciliation bill and the fact that one of those is moving through Congress. And what makes a reconciliation bill unique is that it only requires essentially a simple majority in the Senate. So we have 100 senators total. We only need 51 senators to vote in favor of the reconciliation bill for it to pass. There are, however, certain requirements that go along with the reconciliation bill that have to be met in order for things to be included within that bill. So you certainly can't just throw anything you want into the reconciliation bill, but it is a special measure and it relates to the budget, the federal budget of the US government. Usually a bill in the Senate would take 60 votes, reconciliation bill takes just the 51 in order to pass. I'm sure many of you know that our Senate is currently split down the middle between Republicans and Democrats. We live, as Todd also mentioned earlier, in a very partisan society. It's a very partisan climate. And so getting the two major parties to come together and agree on a lot of things, but especially immigration is a challenge. And it's something that the bishops have been working to help our political leaders navigate, and we've been certainly providing support for a bipartisan solution. The reconciliation bill is at this point viewed as sort of a partisan measure. The current effort is being led by the Democrats in the House and the Senate, but part of that is a push to include legalization and a pathway to citizenship for many of the undocumented currently living in our country. And so it actually just so happens that about a couple of days ago now, we received a ruling from someone known as the Senate parliamentarian, and she ruled that those provisions that had been included in the reconciliation bill don't fit the requirements for the reconciliation bill, those various requirements that I alluded to earlier. So with that being the case, it doesn't mean that the option of including these provisions in this bill it doesn't mean that we've hit a dead end. It just means that we have to kind of step back and specifically members of Congress who are working on this to reassess the options that are available. And there is still a possibility for relief for our undocumented brothers and sisters through this reconciliation bill. But again, we're going to have to see exactly how that plays out. This does happen to be probably one of the best chances we've had in quite some time to get those provisions passed and to get that relief for those undocumented members of our society. And this wouldn't even cover all of the undocumented in our society, but certainly many millions of them would have the opportunity to to become, sort of, for lack of a better phrase, full members of our society, fully recognized members of our society. And why is it important that we have legislation? Why can't President Biden or any other president for that matter, or why shouldn't they just do everything through administrative action, such as an executive order, or why don't we just take everything to the courts and have the courts decide or make decisions about this? Well, the reality is that legislation is sort of the most dependable, it's the most stable way of enacting policy in this country. It's the way that we can ensure that policy remains, or at least it's more dependable in that way. So of course, as we know, one presidential administration comes into office, they may have their own policies that differ from the next administration. Whereas when legislation is passed, there's more of an expectation that you're going to have a bit more certainty and reliability as far as those policies go. So that's sort of a general explanation for why the legislative reform is so important. And so just quickly, Todd already sort of touched on this, but I did want to connect this back to to National Migration Week and the upcoming Day of Migrants and Refugees. And I have two quotes here, one from the bishops, the US bishops in 1986, in which they said, "It is against the common good and unacceptable to have a double society, one visible with rights and one invisible without rights, a voiceless underground of undocumented persons." So 1986 was when that last major immigration reform legislation was passed that I mentioned at the beginning of my section. And even then, the U.S. bishops were saying that we can't have this large population of undocumented persons who aren't fully able to integrate as members of our society. I mean, as those without legal status, they are prevented from doing a lot of things that citizens are able to do, or what we refer to as lawful permanent residents are able to do, those who aren't citizens but still here permanently and with legal status. And so over 30 years later, we have our Holy Father, Pope Francis, also encouraging integration of migrants and refugees within society, especially so that they can seek employment, language instruction, and active citizenship. I mean, it is an expectation of Catholic teaching that Catholics and people of goodwill be engaged in sort of the political functions of a country and of within their local community. And so the fact that undocumented people who have been here for over a decade are still remain unable to do that is certainly contrary to our conception of the common good. Pope Francis uses 4 action words to speak to sort of these, what we should do in reference to our migrant brothers and sisters, migrants and refugees, and other people on the move. He says, welcome, protect, promote, and integrate. So the last two of these, promote and integrate, really get to this idea of ensuring that we don't have a double society, one visible and one invisible. Of course, we know many of the undocumented are in fact very visible, and they're working as essential workers, and they are very much engaged in important roles and making contributions to our society, but at the same time, they still are subject to this threat of deportation and other discrimination as a result of their legal status. So finally, I just want to conclude with things that you all can do to sort of advance the church's teaching with respect to migrants and refugees, and specifically this current push to ensure long-time residents of the United States who are undocumented can pursue lawful status and citizenship. The first step is by going to this website here that I have, and I can pop this into the chat once I conclude, so you all can more easily go to that website. But that is an action alert from the Justice for Immigrants campaign, and that's the campaign of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops that works on immigration reform, and that is related to this current push in Congress and the opportunity this year to acquire relief for our migrant and immigrant brothers and sisters. So there's a lot of information there with that action alert, as well as an ability for you to contact your senators and representative and convey your support for this population and this push. Finally, you can learn more about matters relating to migrants and refugees and all matter of policies within U.S. immigration law by visiting the JFI website. There's also the Center for Migration Studies, which is originally sort of a Catholic initiative and continues to have a lot of connection to the work of Catholic institutions and the bishops. You can write a letter to the editor for your local newspaper or other publication within your parish bulletins, your diocesan publications. And that action alert actually at the top there does have a sample letter to the editor that you can use. Engage with your family, your friends, and fellow parishioners. Talk about these things. It's not always easy. It can be a little bit awkward, a little bit contentious, given sort of the politicization of immigration, but it's important to engage and especially to discuss how these things intersect with our faith, which of course we all take seriously and bears on our daily lives. And finally, but certainly not least of all, you can pray for our migrant and refugee sisters and brothers and others who are on the move, and for those such as our elected leaders and other leaders who have these responsibilities to enact policy that impact these people and us as a society. So I think that's everything from me. Thanks so much, and I think we're holding questions until the end, but happy to answer those at that time.
Great, thank you so much, David, for that information. As you said, it's important for us in the midst of this sort of rapidly changing legal situation to really be grounded in these principles that we have as Catholics and as citizens. So that's important information. Thank you. Dylan, we'll pass it over to you now.
Thanks, Melissa. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. I just want to do a quick time check. How are we on time? Oh.
I'm muted. It's about 1:17 now. So yeah, go ahead and you have the time that we discussed. So.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Deacon Fred. And thanks to the Archdiocese of San Francisco for putting this on and sponsoring. And thanks to David and to Todd, my co-panelists on this presentation. It's wonderful to be with you. I've been asked to speak a little bit about the border. Here at Hope Border Institute, we're on the US-Mexico border, and what's happening. It figures large, of course, in any discussion about immigration. So I'd like to just present you a little bit of a picture of what's happening. So I'll talk first about that. What are the on the ground realities here on the US-Mexico border? Talk a little bit maybe about what the church is doing, what communities of faith are doing to respond to the reality of people on the move at the border. And then perhaps close with just a few reflections on our Holy Father's message for the World Day of Migrants and Refugees. So first, what's happening at the US-Mexico border right now? Well, it's complicated. There's a lot going on. It's hard to follow. It's extremely fluid. So I want to preface my remarks with that because things change on a daily basis. But maybe it'll help if I try to break it down into some chunks. First, what's happening on the micro level? What are we seeing over the past year, or at least in 2021? And then if we take a step back and look at the big picture, the macro level, what are some of the trends that we see, both in terms of the reality of arrivals, but also in terms of our response as a country and things like policy. So first, that micro level, what's happening in 2021? Well, arrivals are real. People continue to come to the US-Mexico border and all parts of the border. It's fluid, so people go to different parts of the border. And we are seeing an uptick in the amount of people that are coming. That's true. But it's hard to get real hard data. It's hard to get clear numbers because we have to temper the reality of increased arrivals that we are seeing in 2021 with the reality of the forced returns that are happening under a policy called Title 42. So there are a number of people who are coming to the border, some of them asylum seekers, some of them seeking protection under asylum law, who are being returned to Mexico or to their countries of origin under a policy called Title 42. And what that's doing is it's incentivized repeat crossings, which makes it a little bit difficult to track how many people are actually coming to the US-Mexico border, because many of these people will try to cross the border repeatedly. So the numbers are a bit inflated. So even if there is sort of an increase in arrivals, an uptick relative to last year, you have to temper that with the reality that people are trying to cross the border multiple times, which also speaks to, I think, some of the desperation that's driving people to come to the US-Mexico border. Why are they coming? They're coming for perennial reasons that we've seen consistent over the last decade. It's a toxic cocktail, a combination of circumstances. Many of them are coming from Central America. So the three biggest countries continue to be Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And the situations that drive people are similar in those countries. The lack of conditions in those countries for safety, for security, for the ability to get a job. The environment is a factor, both long-term factors in the environment, changing climate, for example, increased temperatures in the Pacific Ocean are driving a massive drought in what's known as the dry corridor that goes all the way from southern Mexico through Central America and into Honduras. And then also sudden climate events like the hurricanes that we saw at the end of last year that have driven a lot of people out of countries in Central America, especially Honduras. So a combination of long-term factors, violence, insecurity, economic factors, climate factors, compounded by things like the hurricanes, and then also by the pandemic. The pandemic has hit these countries particularly hard, and it's going to there will be economic ripple effects which will continue to drive migration in the region. This year, we're also seeing a rise in the number of people from beyond those countries in Central America. So there are increasing numbers of migrants who are coming from Mexico, whereas traditionally, or rather in the last 20 years, we've seen migration from Mexico really go down quite a bit. In the last couple of years, it's begun to tick up significantly because of things like insecurity, growing insecurity or persistent insecurity in Mexico, but also a reflection of the pandemic and how the pandemic continues to hit countries that don't have the same resources that we might in the United States to be more resilient to its impacts. And then countries like Ecuador, Venezuela, as you know, the crisis in Venezuela has driven migrants across north up to the US-Mexico border. Haiti, you've probably seen over the last couple of days the arrival of thousands of migrants to one particular part of the border in Texas, but there's been Haitian migration that's been on the increase all this year. And countries like Africa. So we're seeing a growing amount of people coming to the US-Mexico border from beyond those countries which have been sending migrants for some time in Central America. The policies, I mentioned Title 42. So there are a patchwork of policies right now that are in place at the border that are limiting migration. Title 42 is one of the biggest. Title 42 is a pandemic health related order that's been in place since last spring. Under this order, the US government is able to expel migrants directly to Mexico or to their countries of origin. The United States, for example, is removing a lot of the Haitians who came in recent days and flying them directly to Haiti under this order. It gives the government the ability to do that. It's been challenged in the courts, so there are some questions around its legality, and there was a federal court in Washington, D.C. that last week said this was the practice as it was being carried out against families in particular was questionable legally, and the government was ordered to stop, but there's been, the government has appealed that. You've probably heard about Remain in Mexico. Remain in Mexico was a policy instituted towards the end of the Trump administration, which forced asylum seekers to make their asylum claims, which are often difficult and can take a long time. They can take upwards of a year or more, but force people to negotiate those asylum claims not from the security of the United States, where typically people would be allowed to do that, but from places of insecurity in northern Mexico, like Ciudad Juarez, where I am. About 80,000 people were returned under Remain in Mexico to Mexico to negotiate those asylum cases. That process was ended at the very beginning of the term of President Biden, so at the beginning of this year. But the Supreme Court, agreeing with lower courts, has ordered the US government to reinstate the Remain in Mexico program. And so the government has not done that yet, but we expect that to happen. We don't know in what form, we don't know what iteration. It might be different than how it was put into practice under the Trump administration, but that remains to be seen. And there are places on the border where there have been exceptions to Title 42, for example, in South Texas, for complicated reasons that have to do with relationships between the US and Mexico. There have been many people who have not been returned under Title 42. And so there are places on the border where people have been able to cross the border and have been paroled into the United States. So it's complicated. And now we're at risk of having a patchwork of policies that are intended to limit migration. At the beginning of the Biden administration, the Biden administration acted to roll back Remain in Mexico, and they did. Many of the people who were put into Remain in Mexico were given the possibility of returning to the United States to make their asylum cases, and many did. But we still have in place Title 42, which expels people back to Mexico and other countries. And under Title 42, since last spring, there have been more than 1 million expulsions that have taken place. Title 42 in some ways is more consequential than Remain in Mexico because it doesn't allow access to the asylum system. And so there have been bona fide, genuine asylum seekers, traditional asylum seekers who have not been able to make their claims of protection at the border as the law guarantees that they do. Because they've been removed under this policy. So it's very troubling from the perspective of the right to protection that asylum seekers have. Now, that's the micro level. If we take a step back for a minute and look at the big picture, arrivals to the US-Mexico border are nothing new. But what has happened over the last 10, 15 years is that there's an increased number in asylum seekers, an increased number of people seeking asylum who are coming from the border, particularly from Central America, fleeing those conditions that I've described, the lack of security, the lack of economic opportunity, the inability of those countries to provide for the human rights of their populations, things like the drug war, things like violence connected to trafficking of drugs, things like environmental degradation. Those have been drivers that are driving people to the US-Mexico border. At the same time, there are very little avenues for people to get into the country when you're coming from a country like Central America. Our immigration law does not have a lot of spots for people to apply to get into the country. And so asylum has become sort of the option of last resort for many people. And so more and more people are coming, fleeing some very extreme conditions, fleeing lack of opportunity, fleeing violence. But the only way to get into the country to be able to make it into the United States is through the asylum process. And so asylum claims have gone up. And that has caused a conundrum at the US-Mexico border because we have increased people seeking asylum. And we have a system, though, that over that same period of time, the last 15 and 20 years, has not been reoriented or retooled to receive people seeking protection, but has been deployed to stop people from coming to the US-Mexico border, to dissuade and to deter migration to the US-Mexico border. Those are political options that we've made as a country. So we have a system that's designed really to criminalize migration. We deport, we detain, and to harden the border, militarize the border. So in the last 15, 20 years, even though asylum claims, asylum seekers, people coming to the border seeking protection have gone up, the response of the United States hasn't been to retool the system to respond to this, but to make it even more and more difficult for people to come into the United States. And so that's been problematic. But that macro trend you're seeing on a very micro level, even this year. So even as people come to the border seeking protection, take the example of the recent Haitians who have come this year. Haiti is a country that's undergoing significant instability, a lack of law and order. There was the assassination of the Haitian president not too long ago, significant criminality that's driving displacement. This is a country that's wrestling with the effects of the pandemic. It was the last country in the Western Hemisphere, I think, to get the vaccine for the pandemic. And also a recent earthquake that has driven internal displacement. You see countries, people coming from Haiti, and the response of the United States has been to forcibly return Haitians back to Haiti under Title 42, and so without options for making claims of protection for asylum. And so in that little sort of micro example, you see big picture the response of the United States at the US-Mexico border to migration. It's a paradigm. To change that would require a significant paradigm shift in our politics and in how we understand migration. But that's a broader question, and we need the thinking that Todd was talking about. We need some deep thinking in order, if we're going to have a paradigm shift at the border, we're going to need some deep changes in how we understand migration and in our political culture. We also need to rethink things like asylum. The grounds for asylum have not changed since the end of the Cold War. The United States was a leader in erecting the global platform, the global system of protection and asylum. But many of the five bases for asylum have not changed since the end of the Second World War, when we did erect that system, and they reflect Cold War realities. They reflect a post-war reality. And so they don't respond to some of the drivers that we're seeing, for example, from Central America, environmental displacement. Asylum law doesn't really respond to the needs of those who are displaced by climate. The need for protection that women have. Central America is probably one of the most dangerous places in the world for women. There's a lot of gender-based violence in those countries, but our asylum law doesn't necessarily respond to those realities. So asylum law is somewhat anachronistic, and we need to think about new ways of retooling asylum to respond to the genuine drivers that exist today. And root causes. Root causes has come up both by Todd and David in their presentations. One of the most effective things that we can do to regress migration, and moral things that we can do, is to address the root causes. It's to go upstream rather than focusing on the border and putting our energy, our political energy, and our resources into patrolling the border. It's much more effective to go upstream, to move the conversation upstream, and to address those drivers, which is difficult because the United States is in some ways implicated in the drivers that are taking place in Central America historically. And so it's challenging. A few words on, to bring it back to the theme of the World Day of Migrants and Refugees. Our Holy Father, in his message for the World Day of Migrants and Refugees, is calling us to build a wider we. Really, since the beginning of his pontificate, I think the Holy Father has put his finger on one of the core moral challenges of our time, which is to identify and to take away all those artificial lines, all those artificial lines of division that separate us. Todd, in his remarks, talked about how things like nationality and things like borders, these are historical realities. These are contingent realities. The way that we patrol the border says a lot about how we think about the other and how we receive the other. But the Holy Father is asking us to sort of take away all those things that divide us, or critically examine and look at them and keep us from encountering the other and seeing the other not as a threat, but as an opportunity for solidarity. Here on the border, we have an expression in Spanish. We say, "Tú eres mi otro yo." You are my other self. And that's what the Holy Father is calling us to, that a wider we, where we don't see the other as other or threat, but the other is an opportunity for my growth, that in the encounter with the other, that I become more, I become a better person, And it's not just I, but it's we. There's a we. And how we can, it's important to think about how we can facilitate those encounters and build the wider we within our own parishes, within our own ecclesial communities. And then finally, a word just to respond to Todd's point about being a church without borders in a world with ever increasing, with increasingly hardened borders. I think it's important that as church, well, I think it's important that we recognize that this work is already happening, whether it's at the US-Mexico border or whether it's in countries of origin, like the countries in Central America, or countries of transit like Mexico, countries of arrival like the United States, communities of destination. The church is there. The church is there, whether it's pastoral services or legal services. This is certainly happening in the Archdiocese, in the diocese in Southern California, in all the dioceses on the US-Mexico border. The church is accompanying people at every stage, providing pastoral support, providing legal support, providing integration into the local community in a myriad of ways, through professional services like legal services and legal clinics, migrant shelters, or simply the opportunity for community that we find in our parish communities. It's important, I think, that migrants find, when they make that journey from destination to transit to countries of destination, to countries of origin, transit, and communities of destination, it's important that they feel that they've been accompanied not by many churches along the route, but by one church. And in that sense, I think the church we are a church without borders. We can do better. We can critically examine the ways that we can increase our accompaniment and our pastoral solidarity with people who are on the move. But we definitely do have a church without borders in our region, in the United States, and in the broader region that we can be proud of. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dylan, for providing that insight about what's happening at the border, especially, and how policies are really having an impact on people's lives and policies and people's work down there as well. So we're just over an hour now, but we might have time for just one or two questions. If anybody has them in the chat, you can go ahead and put them in.
Melissa, I also promised earlier to put in that link, so I'm going to go ahead and drop that in the chat too for everyone, so that they can use that to access that action alert I mentioned.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I would ask the question, I guess, to all of you. Since this is such a hot button issue right now, it's something that's in our news daily almost. Is there a perspective that you would change in how it's presented widely in our national news?
Sure. I mean, I'll comment briefly, and certainly others can, add on to that or just say something different. But I mean, I think that one of the problems we have with in sort of the news cycle is that it's built on controversy, and it's built on kind of building up sort of conflict. And so you have competing interests that are portraying migrants in certain ways as opposed to other news agencies that are portraying them in different ways. And they're really talking to a specific base of people, in order to maximize, ad revenue, to raise status for, certain individuals, whether it's a commentator or a politician or that sort of thing. And so, I mean, I think that it is skewed right from the outset in terms of what they're trying to achieve. The migrant themselves is kind of a toy or a plaything to be used for the benefit of another goal or objective. And so, I mean, I think anything that, really is more honest, because there's a kind of just basic level deceit, I think, that's at play in a lot of the news that's portrayed, not all, but in large segments that appeal to a large number of people. And so I think just trying to, being more honest about who the migrant is on an individual level, who is this particular migrant, what is their particular story, how do they get to where they are, and why by accident is them and not us. would be an important way to kind of personalize and to make clear the situation that we're dealing with. It's not all wrapped up in sort of advertising and status symbols and that sort of thing. That would be one way.
I would just add really briefly onto that hopefully if you took nothing else from this presentation that we've collectively given, you at least take away that this is not a simple issue. There are a lot of complexities involved here, and I mean, Todd points out a really important point, which is at the end of the day, we're talking about people. And so the policies themselves are very complex, and it's really easy to say, well, we need to secure the border and then everything else can follow from that. But the complexities of the immigration system, immigration law, and beyond that, and most importantly, sort of the people who are involved. And as I mentioned, the over 10 million who are residing in the United States, they each have their own story, and it's not a simple story of they came here unlawfully across the US-Mexico border and they just want to have a good job. I mean, many of them, again, are escaping persecution or seeking to provide for their families. They have children, they own businesses, they own homes. So none of these situations that we find ourselves in with respect to migration or the immigration system are easy fixes or easy solutions. And it can be easy and tempting, especially to our political leaders in all their wisdom, to have these sort of simplistic tropes or to have these phrases that they like to say because they're quick and they're catchy, but it doesn't reflect the reality of the fact that these are people. Or that these issues are complicated and complex and require really a lot of critical thinking and sort of working through to get to a solution that's just and actually benefits the common good for all.
Okay, thank you. Well, I don't see any other questions in our chat, so I would just like to again thank you all for being here. Todd, David, Dylan, it was really a great conversation. We saw a lot of different aspects of the issue, and I want to thank you for being here and sharing your time and your expertise with us today. And let's all continue observing National Migration Week through Sunday.
Thank you, Melissa. I really appreciate you having us on here.
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, Deacon, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you so much for everything, you guys. That was a great and wonderful presentation. And I really appreciate everything you do and continue the good work.
Thank you as well. You as well. Take care.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.